But, it's still, for someone like me that comes from national security, it's still fairly alarming to see people like Tulsi Gabbard named, as you said. I'm highly alarmed as someone who worked on the COVID pandemic task force to see RFK's name thrown in the mix, and some of the people that are going to run the FDA, and getting placed in Surgeon General. So I think my reaction is one of confirmation that, yes, I expected it, but also a little bit of, I have got to be honest, anxiety over these picks, knowing the damage that they could do.
Hello, friends, and welcome back to Highly Conflicted, where we unpack the news inside Trump world and what might be coming down next at Mar-a-Lago. Trump's picks for his cabinet are now complete, and we have a good sense of the White House staff that will be in the West Wing next year as well. Politico AM recently called it a, quote, team of randos, which was pretty funny and not inaccurate, but there also have been some pretty problematic people that have been nominated for some pretty big positions, especially from a national security standpoint. At the cabinet level, for Senate confirmations, we have people like Tulsi Gabbard as the Director of National Intelligence. John Ratcliffe is up for CIA Director. Gabbard, just by way of example, may have a rough time in her Senate confirmation hearings over a number of questionable incidents from her career. These include spreading Russian propaganda over the war in Ukraine, prompting critics to ask if she might be a Russian asset, as well as her making a clandestine visit to Syria to meet the country's president, Bashar al-Assad, who has been accused of war crimes. And in non-Senate confirmed roles, for instance, we have people like Kash Patel, who may be up for Deputy FBI Director, and people like Seb Gorka, who has been named as the Senior Counterterrorism Director for Trump. To break this all down, we have Olivia Troye with us today, who was a senior counterterrorism advisor to Vice President Mike Pence and was a senior part of the first Trump administration, who is in a uniquely qualified position to assess the landscape and weigh in on some of these picks. Olivia, thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Hugo. Thanks for having me.
So let's just start at a 30,000-foot God's eye perspective on these cabinet nominees, because there's been a bunch. We have a full cabinet now, but just briefly, what stood out to you? Like, what was your reaction to some of these names?
I think look, I have to be honest. I expected this to be the type of cabinet that Trump would put in place. So some of these were just confirmation of the fact that this was the plan all along. I think, there's a lot of talk about Project 2025, and I think we're seeing a lot of the names that were in that Heritage Foundation document being reflected in the types of lineup that he has. So I'm not surprised to see Russ Vought in it. I'm not surprised to see Tom Homan in it. He played a big part in the Department of Homeland Security aspects of it. But, it's still, for someone like me that comes from national security, it's still fairly alarming to see people like Tulsi Gabbard named, as you said. I'm highly alarmed as someone who worked on the COVID pandemic task force to see RFK's name thrown in the mix, and some of the people that are going to run the FDA, and getting placed in Surgeon General. So I think my reaction is one of confirmation that, yes, I expected it, but also a little bit of, I have got to be honest, anxiety over these picks, knowing the damage that they could do to a lot of these agencies, having, as you said, worked in the Trump administration firsthand, sat at the cabinet table many times in these meetings where policy was being made. And the people sitting at that table really do make a difference in what happens next, right? And the trajectory of what we're going to see in our country.
Let's look at the national security area then, because that is your background. And, people like Ratcliffe, they're not new to Trump world. In fact, they were around in the first admin. What do you think of someone like John Ratcliffe for CIA Director? And how could his loyalty or personal sensibilities impact, I guess, how the agency is run, but also the fact that he will have a direct line to Trump. He just does. He has his own personal relationship. And so if he is in the ear of the president, how could that affect policy?
Well, I think what I'm worried about with some of these individuals, especially someone like him and Tulsi, is I'm concerned that they'll politicize intelligence and politicize the community that, for the most part, really strives to be nonpartisan and operates on facts. And so my concern is that direct line and that loyalty relationship, which is what a lot of these people are. They're complete Trump loyalists, is that there won't be people taking a stand and saying, no, this is what the intelligence says, whether it comes to things like the travel ban, which the intelligence community played a role in terms of the list of countries, whether it comes to things like foreign adversaries and what they're doing here domestically, their involvement, whether it's social media or elections or a number of things. Where will he fall on telling Donald Trump the truth about what the intelligence community's fact-finding missions are saying? And my concern on that is that it goes both ways too, because what will he be tasking the community to do, and what kind of resources is he going to be applying towards this community overseas? And I think we've seen a number of alarming things. Certainly to someone like me, we saw the classified documents at Mar-a-Lago, the aftermath of that, and the connections that these people have in these circles. And so that gives me pause because, where is their loyalty? Is it to the Constitution and the country, or is it loyalty to Donald Trump and what he wants to push with his agenda? And when you combine someone like Ratcliffe with Tulsi Gabbard, who is at the top of the intelligence community, overseeing all of the intelligence agencies, I think that becomes incredibly worrisome. And then combine that along with the Department of Justice and who will be there. This has been the concern all along, is that, the people that served before, who were willing to push back on things and, give the other side of the issue and say, well, yes, Mr. President, you can do this, but just know that the consequences could be that our diplomacy with so-and-so country or intelligence information sharing could be limited, and it could hurt us here domestically in terms of some security aspects of it. Those are the things that keep me up at night right now, is just, how does this impact the safety and security of Americans when you have these types of individuals leading a community that's supposed to keep us safe in a nonpartisan, very factual way?
And specifically with the CIA, I think people sometimes forget that things like security clearances, which became a big thing in the first admin, as I'm sure you remember, the CIA plays a big role because they have equities in some of this intelligence gathering and intelligence briefings. We talk a lot about FBI background briefings and background checks rather, and the FBI making sure that you don't have individuals who are compromised or who might have vulnerabilities that can be exploited for blackmail by adversaries. But the same also goes for the CIA. And if you think back to people like Jared Kushner and the problems that Kushner had in getting his top level security clearances, it was mainly because, as it was reported at the time, it was the CIA was like, there's no way we want to give this guy access to kind of human source human source level intelligence because we don't trust him based on his contacts with Russia and Israel and the UAE. But I don't know, I suppose if someone like Ratcliffe is top of the CIA, that maybe the agency won't be in a position to raise those sort of flags in the first place. I don't know how the transmission mechanism works, I guess.
No, I think you're right. I think it's going to be quite challenging. And look, also, we got to think about it from the perspective of the intelligence community and the officers on the ground who are currently serving overseas. I can't imagine how they must feel right now, because they need to have confidence that the leadership has their backs. And so when they're passing this information, if their lives are compromised or this information is compromised, well, what I'm trying to say is like it would put their lives at risk, and it would compromise their situation and the people that they're dealing with on the ground. And so I think the security posture across the board right now has got to be causing concern at these agencies as they go into this new era with the Trump team. And look, you're absolutely correct. I mean, I think the one big elephant in the room, no pun intended, perhaps, is Russia. What is happening here with Russia? Because right now, to me, the connection amongst a lot of these people is the Russia propaganda that they have been involved in and have spread, and they've sided on that side of Russia, right? So I think a lot of people are watching what's happening with Ukraine and what's going to happen in this dynamic, and I am concerned about what this means for like our international diplomacy and our international relations. I'm also concerned about the intelligence sharing. I mean, what does it look like for the rest of the world, for our allies and partners that we normally share intelligence, which keeps us here domestically safe by doing that? I'm not convinced that they're going to feel comfortable sharing intelligence with the United States and our agencies, because why would they do that? Why would they compromise their own security posture to be a partner with us when they're not sure what is happening here domestically? And that to me is incredibly damaging in terms of what this means going forward for America.
And just on that, I mean, let's think about the DNI for a moment, because the DNI is a bit of a weird um, agency, right? It's not really the leader as it is described to me as one of the top IC agencies. You know, you have the FBI and you have the agency, and then you have like the DNI, which I think sometimes in the intelligence community gets derided as something of like a clearinghouse. But maybe in this administration, someone like Tulsi Gabbard will play a big role, not only because the DNI, I guess, ends up filtering intel or intel briefings to the president, but also because Tulsi Gabbard herself has her own sensibilities when it comes to Russia. You know, she has been a particular defender of Russia and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I mean, could you speak a little bit about how kind of the process works and how intelligence gets from the IC, maybe through the DNI or not through the DNI, to the president, and how if Tulsi Gabbard, for instance, wanted to politicize that role and wanted to insert herself as a gatekeeper or a filter, you know, could she do that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this was something that I think during the first Trump administration, I saw, I worked very closely with the DNI. A lot of the people serving in these roles were actually mentors of mine throughout my career. And I saw them have to navigate the issue of Russia very carefully. And when they spoke truthfully in the Oval Office about what was happening with Russia, a lot of them got fired. And so I think that tells you the type of situation and the type of information that the national security community holds when it comes to people like foreign adversaries like Russia, countries like Russia, right? And when you have that, I'm just curious to what Tulsi Gabbard is going to do, because she can very much, like, very well shift the collection posture across and set priorities differently across the intelligence community. That is a big role that the DNI plays. She can also decide, make decisions and influence across the intelligence agencies on what the presidential daily briefings are going to be like. That's if Donald Trump actually takes them, because for the most part, he used to skip those. So, or she may decide, hey, if Donald Trump doesn't want to take his intelligence briefing on a daily basis, then I'll brief him. And she's giving her perspective of the community that she is interpreting that information. And so she becomes really the gatekeeper for that. And it'll be interesting to see whether John Ratcliffe decides what kind of legacy he wants to leave for the intelligence community, how that dynamic is going to play out. Are they going to work together in sort of a band of brothers type of way, or are they going, and is he going to go along with whatever she does as well, because they're both sort of coming at it from the same lens. And I think that will be something interesting to kind of follow. And I think we'll see it. I think, while a lot of national security stuff, happens behind the scenes, certainly one thing the Trump White House was notorious for is that information does get out and personal agendas start to surface. And I think we'll kind of see sort of that infighting play out. And we'll also see it with our allies, and we'll see it across the world when things start to happen. And we'll see it, we'll see what Tulsi Gabbard, how she's explaining things publicly when she testifies, if she decides to testify along the way. So I'm curious. I'm curious to see what the U.S. Senate is going to do during their confirmation hearings, and see if these types of things are going to be brought up, how she'll explain her past history when she has, spread conspiracies as well that were in line with some conspiracies with Russia. How will she talk about that, and how will she explain that in terms of her, being able to navigate the intelligence community and lead it in a way that's nonpartisan? But I don't think that is why she was chosen, right?
What's always really interesting to me when it comes to Trump and intelligence products is, on the one hand, he hates the reading, as has been widely reported. He wants really bite-sized information. He wants a lot of pictures. But increasingly, as the Trump admin progressed, it seemed to me like he actually did like the intelligence when he wanted it. And, you would see him disseminate, whether it was the site of the Iran site that they had bombed, or whatever it was. He just tweeted stuff out, and he just held photographs up for cameras. And so there have been plenty of instances where he's actually quite liked to be in receipt of the intelligence. And we saw it in the classified documents case when Trump held on to 101 classified documents at Mar-a-Lago because he likes the trappings of the office, and he likes the trappings of getting briefed by generals and kind of intelligence community kind of officials. I don't know. I think it will be interesting to see what he picks and chooses. But by the sounds of what you're saying, I mean, it also sounds like the DNI and Tulsi will be able to just give him really what he wants and nothing else, right?
Yeah, I think that's a concern, right? Is that traditionally, sometimes the intelligence community will come and brief policymakers, and sometimes it'll tell them what they don't necessarily want to hear, but it's the facts. And then it's up to the policymakers to make decisions on it. I think in this situation, he may end up with a very one-sided view that goes along with what she will know is his agenda and the viewpoint and the consensus of what they're thinking. And she's not going to be that person that's going to bring it in a factual manner and represent all sides of it, which is really just to the detriment of the country when you do things like that. Because, I mean, intelligence exists to inform, right? And it's not, and then, it's over to the policymakers to actually make the ultimate decisions when it comes to, foreign engagements, whether it comes to conflicts that are happening around the world. And I think it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. I think, she'll have a number of areas. I mean, I know, given her past with Russia, I think that is one key thing that everyone's watching on how this is going to impact. But, we've got Israel, we've got Gaza, there's a lot happening around the world. And when you have some of the picks that are being chosen and talked about in terms of who the ambassador is going to be to Israel and what they're going to be doing, it'll be interesting to see what role she plays in that and in shaping that sort of information and policy as well.
You were the counterterrorism advisor to Pence. We now have Seb Gorka, this
I
deeply
can't even
polarizing figure.
process that right now.
Right. And so, can you explain a little bit about what that role entails day to day? And I mean, it's a very specific role. It's not something top level that we hear about a lot, or you kind of see officials talk about a lot. I mean, could you give us a sense of what the day to day role is? And someone like Seb Gorka, who has really direct lines to Viktor Orban, could
Yeah, it's
bring.
very concerning. Yeah, it's incredibly disturbing because that person in that role basically serves as the entire coordinator for the counterterrorism community, which means that they are coordinating across the entire U.S. government, the national security community, and every agency that plays a role in anything that's related to responses, whether it's in counterterrorism policy. And so to see someone like that in it, one, I think is going to be concerning for the agencies because now you have someone sitting at the head of the table that is running policy directly for Donald Trump because that is the role that that person plays. Their role is to really implement the president's agenda. But they also have a powerful seat because they are the convener. They're the convener of information. They're the convener of these counterterrorism policy meetings where the government is making decisions in these meetings and then it gets briefed to the cabinet. So there's a lot of control that that individual has. And the other part of it is that office. I mean, this is where the U.S. government, in terms of the National Security Council and the White House, has been it's been very complicated because that counterterrorism office deals with not just foreign counterterrorism, but they also deal with domestic terrorism as well. And I think it's going to be interesting. I mean, I'm very concerned about what will happen with domestic extremism, what's going to happen in the aftermath of hate crimes and hate-driven mass shootings, in the aftermath of that and the response to that. How do we counter that? What are we going to do with domestic extremism? What are we going to do with neo-Nazis? What are we going to do with the rise of extremist groups in our country? That person in that role is also looking at those issues because it's not quite divided. And so it definitely, I used to sit in those meetings. When you're in the vice president's staff, you work very closely with the people in these roles. But ultimately, I had established my own lines with senior, people at intelligence agencies just because I had been in my career for almost 20 years. And so when certain people in that directorate towards the end of the administration took those roles, there was a shift in that office on how they were operating and the information that they were giving people and how they were running meetings. And so when I realized what was happening and I realized that, I was only getting half the information, it wasn't necessarily factual in the way that it should be in the aftermath of serious incidents around the world, I actually carved my own path because I was definitely dedicated to serving the vice president the way the role should be done, and he should be receiving factual, comprehensive overview, and then over to him and how he decides to weigh in on things. But my thing was, I was truly committed so that he wouldn't misspeak publicly, that he wouldn't spread disinformation and misinform the public, because that's a very important thing for our nation's leaders. And that office can play a big role in that. And so I think it's going to be interesting given Sebastian Gorka's past and the things that he's said and done. I mean, it reminds me of, his wife was at DHS back in the day when I was there. I know these circles very well. I've seen the way they operate. It reminds me of some of his connections at DHS that were the kind of people that were sending me Google articles and telling me to include it in my intelligence products when it came to executive orders that I was going to carry out. And so I think that's a very critical role. And I'm sure that the community right now is trying to grapple with how they're going to deal with this. Because again, I mean, every president has people that are going to drive his agenda, right? I mean, that is normal. That's what happens in policy. That's what happens in intelligence, and that's fair. I think the problem is when you have someone like Sebastian Gorka and you look at the kinds of things that he posts, the kinds of things that he talks about, when you have someone that's aligned with certain more extreme viewpoints and agendas, I think that can really color the type of policy that will be enacted or coordinated. And I think it's going to have a chilling effect too, across the counterterrorism community. I mean, how are you going to navigate this person sitting at the head of the table when you know where their priorities are and that you know where they're coming from? Traditionally, that role is a longtime counterterrorism expert that serves in these roles, who's had a lot of experience in the community, who understands how to do government policy, who understands in a crisis when we're trying to prevent a terrorist attack, which is why this is critical as well, that person is convening the meetings to have these conversations. And so I have to say I was upset to see that, and to really, it just like, it was very concerning to me, because I'm very concerned about what that looks like going forward when we're trying to coordinate and prevent an attack happening on our soil or overseas. They play a role in that too with the different agencies and departments. What does it look like under him?
And is there a way for career officials to, at any of these agencies, to get factual information to the White House if the normal channels are not working? If you're a career official at the CIA or the FBI or the NSA, and you see massive red flags that you think should be flagged to the president, and you have an inkling that they are not, because whether it's Seb Gorka or whoever else is, or Tulsi is putting a filter on the information that is getting to the president, is there a way to circumvent that, or is it at this point it's kind of a lost cause?
It becomes quite challenging. I'll tell you, the way that I circumvented that was that I had a separate lane. I had Mike Pence. And while people may judge him on his, viewpoints on policy in certain areas, Mike Pence was loyal to the Constitution, and he was very concerned about the safety and security of Americans. I mean, he did his intelligence briefings every day. He wanted to know what was happening in terms of our national security community. And so the way I navigated that was that people knew that they could come to me and they could get me factual information, and that I could give it to the vice president, and that he could weigh in at times with Donald Trump. The problem is that we don't have that anymore. This is a very different situation of people that are going to be there. And so I don't know. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know if it will be people who are serving for the greater good and not for the greater good of themselves or one specific agenda. It's whether they're going to be people that are going to be willing to say, hey, I've got to weigh in. This person is not passing this forward. And it's hard. It's hard to bypass that office, because the person in the meetings, in the cabinet meetings, it's going to be briefing the national security advisor, is that person in that role. And so the only reason that, I was able to navigate in my counterterrorism role was because I was in the vice president's office, and it was a separate thing. And so, when misinformation and disinformation surfaced along the way, and it did, I want to be very clear about that. Some of it came from some of the people that are being considered for very, very senior, like cabinet level roles. Those were the people feeding the disinformation that I had to counter. And when that happened, I went around and I went through the vice president to kind of try to walk it back, because it would be detrimental for the American public if it went out that way. And so I think that is going to be the challenge of navigating in this space. And then the other part of that, I'll be honest, is that once that person in that role, towards the end of administration, it was people like Kash Patel, people like Chris Miller who were in those roles. Once they started to catch on to the fact that perhaps the one angled agenda was being countered by facts in a different way, then it becomes incredibly challenging to navigate the space, because then they know, then they start to watch out for others. And that's how you get the deep state narrative. And then that's how they start to purge people. And so I think the plan is to actually purge people and put loyalists in from day one. So I think that kind of changes the dynamic there. But, how quickly they do that, who knows? But I do think that that's going to be part of the problem, is that you're going to have sort of people that are going to be yes men surrounding in these offices that are going to be appointed. There's going to be a lot of, effort to ensure that. And I don't know that there's going to be anyone that's going to want to go against that, even if they know that they need to be, even if they know that the information isn't necessarily accurate or it's very one-sided or biased.
And just to be clear, did you have any career officials or anyone try and get information to you to pass on to the vice president?
Oh, yeah.
Was that a figure?
Yes. And actually, I can think of a specific time where somebody had given very bad information claiming that there was a terrorist cell that was about to launch across the country. And that information had been walked into the Oval Office. And I spent an entire evening, an entire night walking that back, scrambling around, going to different people, going to the vice president's chief of staff, going to the vice president himself, and saying to him, please don't repeat that. And you need to weigh in on this because it's incorrect. It's inaccurate. I've been in the meetings with the intelligence community, law enforcement agencies. They have all said that there is no indication of this. There is no intelligence to back this up. This is one individual who has misinformed someone, passed that information, called it in, and that information was walked right into the Oval Office. The next morning, after all this effort went on behind the scenes to prove and for me to show them that the intelligence and law enforcement community had said, no, this is incorrect, it's not true, then it was Bill Barr who walked into the Oval Office and had to walk it back. But somebody passed that information into the Oval before he did. And so we were able to de-escalate it. But it has real world consequences because it could have impacted a lot of things that happened on military bases. It could have impacted international security agreements with people. It was that kind of a level of thing. And so that's why things like this are very serious.
Well, that's extraordinary. And so thank you for sharing that story with us. I guess we will see how it plays out in the months ahead, especially as Trump takes office in January. But Olivia, it's always great to talk with you. So thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Hugo.
I'm Hugo Lowell, a senior political correspondent at The Guardian. Special thanks to our guest today, Olivia Troye.